Today I have with me Professor Stephen Pow. We will be discussing today the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary in 1242, the theories around it, as well as Stephen's own specific theory regarding it. Stephen, I'm glad you could make it today.
Well, thanks for having me, Jack, as always. I mean, I presume you're going to have me in the future, so...
So Stephen last year completed his PhD, and he wrote his thesis on the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary. He's written numerous articles on the topic, so he is very familiar with both the historiography as well as the primary sources. So if you're looking to talk to someone about it, Stephen's a pretty good choice to go for. And now I suppose that we should talk a bit about our historical chronology as well as the problem we will be focusing on. So, of course, the Mongols invaded the Kingdom of Hungary in December 1240. And, of course, in the spring of 1241, they won their famous victory at Muhi, only a day or two after their also famous victory at Liegnitz in Poland. And, of course, this was the army under Batu in Subadai, had just recently completed the conquest of the Western Steppe, which included everyone west of the Ural River. After the battle at Muhi in 1241, the army of the Hungarian kingdom was effectively destroyed. And for the next year, the Mongols run rampant over the kingdom east of the Danube. They are able to cross the frozen Danube in the winter of 1241 and attack the westernmost part of the Hungarian kingdom, even riding into Austria briefly before withdrawing in the spring of 1242. The standard explanation for, I would imagine, most works on the Mongols is, of course, Ögedai Khan, the Great Khan of the Mongol Empire and the son of Chinggis Khan, died on the 11th of December 1241. And the reason, therefore, that the Mongols withdrew is that they all had to rush back to Mongolia and elect the next Great Khan. However, there's a number of problems with this, or perhaps the most significant problem is that this is not actually what happened. The Mongols did not all run back to Mongolia. Batu and a number of the princes and generals, including Subadai, stayed on the Volga River. They did not return to Mongolia. Subadai, in his case, did not return to Mongolia for a couple of years. Batu never returns. And the next Great Khan is not elected until 1246. So in light of this fact, for several decades now, the scholarship has been exploring alternative explanations. And broadly, these fall into three main categories: environmental, military, and political. Stephen and I are going to go over these older explanations, assess them, offer a few criticisms, and then go into Stephen's recent alternative explanation. Now, before we go further, I'm going to have a few brief disclaimers and things I want you to keep in mind. First of all, we are not Eurocentrists or Mongol supremacists trying to justify anything or say that, oh, our side would have won or anything like that. We are not interested in that. What we are discussing here is the scholarly literature, and we are interested in what the primary sources say. That is, the surviving textual and archaeological evidence from the 13th and 14th centuries. We are not here to pick sides, and we do not care about the national myth you learned in school, where you were taught that actually your ancestors were the ones who forced the Mongols to flee. And I would also ask that you forget the popular image of the Mongol army as some sort of force of nature, unbound by physics and totally unstoppable. The Mongol army was undoubtedly impressive, but they were still humans. They fought, bled, got fatigued, and died just like everyone else. So when we talk about setbacks the Mongols suffered, do not have this feeling like we are playing down the Mongols, because the Mongols routinely suffered setbacks. They were often pushed back or had to come up with new strategies or were defeated. What makes them impressive is the fact that they were normally able to do this and normally able to come back from reverses. Remember that it took them some 70 years to complete the conquest of China. The Mongols did not just show up and have everyone immediately die in front of them.
I'll just quickly say, the impressive element of the Mongol conquest is that it did happen in the real world like we know today, with its constraints of human physiology and everything else, and that psychologically the Mongols were very determined, and even if they lost or even if an army's commander died, they'd come back again the next year. There was this ruthless persistence that often paid off in their conquest. And that's the lesson. That's a big lesson from the Mongol Empire. It might not be as comic book-like as we would have it, that they're just invincible in combat, but it's still a valuable story because it's useful in our own lives. Because it was this world that they conquered in. This very same 3 dimensions.
But I think, too, that people tend to sort of retroactively look at a limit of conquest and assume that that is some sort of hard point, that's like predetermined, they won't go beyond this, that there's some sort of almost like a line in the sand that once you cross that sand, now the army doesn't work anymore. And that's not how history works. It's not any predefined path that the Mongols, there's no, in my opinion, there's no inherent quality about Europe that stops it from being conquered by the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. It's the way the 13th century ends up playing out that such a conquest never happens, but there's not anything inherently special that means Europe does not end up getting conquered, while China, Iran, basically everything else in the Eurasian continent does end up getting conquered.
Yeah, I think there in the Mongol worldview, there's no exceptions to the demand for world conquest. The Teb Tengri didn't. This was the shaman who told Chinggis Khan his destiny was to conquer the world. Although that's what that stories say, and Chinggis Khan may have come up with this idea himself as well. Let's not forget, but they had a belief that Chinggis Khan and his dynasty was going to conquer the world, and there weren't exceptions to this, like except for Europe. Don't conquer Europe. There's no special destiny of Europe in the 1200s Mongolian worldview. There's nothing special about Europe, and that's a key thing to imagine when we imagine this invasion of Europe in the 1240s.
And I think, as we'll probably get into this a bit more later, but if there had been political and military will and the resources put to the task, then they would have conquered Europe. It's sort of the fluke of history that such a thing does not develop. And in short, the adequate resources never get put to the region for such a purpose. So we'll start first with perhaps the most famous theory, that is the political one. And that is that the death of Ögedai Han in December 1241 caused the Mongol withdrawal. Often perhaps the most popular for people interested in the Mongol Empire, because it preserves sort of the military legacy or military reputation of the Mongols. Because by supporting that theory, you're not saying the Mongols had to retreat because of any sort of military losses or military needs, but they had to retreat because their political system demanded it. That if Ögedai hadn't died, the implication usually is that the Mongols would have gone on and conquered everything in Europe up to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, not just but many scholars have pointed out a number of issues with this. We pointed out at the start already, the princes did not all immediately rush back to Mongolia. Batu stays for several years on the Volga, as well as numerous other princes, and Subutai stays with him as well.
We have two years recorded in Subutai's biography that help shed some light on the very end of this campaign in Europe, the termination, and then Subutai going back to Mongolia. In 1243, the records record that Batu did not want to go to the assembly that was being called in Mongolia, and Subutai said, "How can you refuse to go?" And then, sort of misleadingly, the following year, 1244, the biography of Subutai states that Batu and some other princes held a Hariltai on the Volga River, which is, of course, very far away from Mongolia, and that's where Batu established Batu Sarai, his capital, or his brother Berka continued it. But this was his base. This became the base of the Golden Horde, the Volga River. So it seems like the biography is trying to smooth something over. It's trying to say that Batu didn't want to participate in an assembly in 1243, and Subutai said, "You have to go. You're one of the older brothers of the imperial family." And then in 1244, he did participate in a Hariltai, mind you, on the Volga River. And what we might take this as is this was the final parting of the army, the 1244 event on the Volga River. Let's take it as a historical fact. And this is when Subutai is probably given permission to leave. And we know from both his biography and from John of Plano Carpini, who you are going to mention, that in 1246, Subutai is back in the Mongol capital, or Mongol horde's capital.
Yeah, in Karakorum, in Mongolia. Yeah. So, and that's really demonstrated when people say the Mongols all had to go back to Mongolia for the election. There was no immediate election. The army did not go back to Mongolia. There's political struggles in Mongolia until 1246, as Ögedai's widow, the regent Turagene, is essentially trying to maneuver things into place to ensure that her son, Guyuk, becomes Khan. And it takes her several years of essentially bribery, forcing people into place to get enough support, because there were other sons of Ögedai, his grandsons, who were all possible contenders. So with that being said, though, does it still make sense for Ögedai's death to have caused a withdrawal? Though it is popular for people to say this, that the Mongols had this rule where everyone had to fall back to Karakorum, or the capital, and elect the next Great Khan. This is not really the case, though. First of all, this is never outlined as a requirement in the sources. The only requirement in the Mongol Empire for a legal election is for all the representatives of the family of Chinggis Khan's four sons with Berti. Representatives from each of these lineages had to be present, and the election had to be held in the Onan, in the region of the Onan River in northeastern Mongolia. Though people love to repeat this, everyone had to run back and elect the Khan. There's not really that many examples of that happening specifically. What we often see is the princes' armies continuing to function, to fight, and be on campaign after the Khan dies. Hubelai Khan himself, after the death of his brother Mönk in 1259, continues to campaign after Mönk's death. After Guyuk's death, after Ögedai's death, armies in the Middle East are continuing to campaign, to march into India. This is often an extrapolation on the part of sort of modern writers, but there's not really that much support for it. It's never outlined as a rule. So Batu, his presence is not required. It would be obviously better if he was there, being that he was one of the senior princes of the family. So his presence would have been very good, but not required. He could have just sent a representative. Orda, Batu's older brother, who was on campaign, he actually gets along very well with Guyuk. And Guyuk did not get along very well with Batu. They had sort of fought with each other during the course of the campaign in the Rus principalities. Batu was not really that good of a commander. There's a couple cases of him needing to be helped out at sieges. And this conflict between them even shows up in the secret history of the Mongols, where Guyuk is calling Batu old woman Batu, and they're insulting each other. And so this conflict was well known. Ögedai had essentially declared every single one of his sons and grandsons, except Guyuk, at various points and probably various stages of sobriety, as being his possible heirs. But Guyuk, as the oldest son of, it was probably recognized that Guyuk was a likely contender. Batu, probably not in a rush to go and take part in that.
The older brothers seem to have sometimes, you could say an older brother, even this term Akka and Ini, the older and younger brothers, a senior brother probably had an advantage. Certainly did, if we look at the general picture of succession, even in Mongol and successor states, but it wasn't guaranteed. Chinggis Khan's successor was his third son, Ögedai.
But the question, though, could Batu and the army in Western Hungary have even learned of Ögedai's death by the time the withdrawal began in 1242? Now, Stephen has tackled this problem thoroughly in his thesis.
The only way the political explanation for Ögedai's death being the cause of Batu's withdrawal, the only way that this can work, this theory, is if we imagine that it's possible that messengers reached Hungary from Mongolia in a few short months, because Ögedai died December 11th. We have the exact date from the records. December 11th, 1241, Ögedai dies. The Mongols withdrew at the end of March, according to a European source, and many sources kind of corroborate this picture that there's still snow on the ground. It was early letters corroborate that the Mongols are already
the European
gone.
source, so that's Master Roger, and I'll just mention this. He's not just a guy. He was actually captured by the Mongols and sort of forced. He was traveling with the army during most of its withdrawal through Hungary. So he's a direct eyewitness, and he basically records the exact moment when the withdrawal begins, more or less.
Yeah, and it couldn't have been very late in the spring. And so anyway, December 11th to, let's say, April 1st. This isn't, or even say middle of April, even though we ought not to say that, going by the source material, but let's say that only gives how many months? 4 months.
Yeah.
4 months to cross the whole of... 4 months or less to cross the whole of Eurasia, basically, and not just any season. Ask anyone who lives in Yakutsk, Kazakhstan, Siberia. Ask these people if the travel conditions are just as easy by land in the winter as in the summer or spring. They might say, well, you have the advantage. Someone might say, Mongols had the advantage, that's why they chose to attack Russia in the winter, because the rivers and the mud would freeze, whereas in the spring and summer you have the mud. But still, there's a whole set of problems that come with winter travel, including dying of exposure, blizzards, and this is the very coldest season when Ögedai dies. And yes, these are Mongols, yes, they have adapted their lifestyle to be able to survive in horrifying blizzard conditions, that even freeze the livestock solid. This just happened in recent times, several times. We've seen Mongolian livestock frozen standing. This is how bad the climate how severe it can be.
And this is in a winter too. The winter of 1241 is also one described as particularly terrible. You have the calculations in your thesis. You essentially took all of the travel accounts from people who traveled the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries and the length of time it took them to get between various points. And now, these are not just a merchant going across the distance. Most of these are envoys, diplomats, messengers who are traveling with Mongol messengers through the Yam system, the famous postal stations. And it is still taking them approximately 100 days to travel from Karakorum to Sarai on the Volga. Now it's 100 days, so that's about 4 months, right?
Yeah.
Right there.
And we mustn't forget, even the end of March could have been when the Mongols were withdrawing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what one source specifically says. So we have less than 4 months for these.
Yeah.
And that's presuming messengers leave to go to Europe on the day Ögedai dies.
So remember what we said a few minutes ago about Guyuk and Batu having a falling out and not getting along well. This was presumably known well to the Mongolian court. The secret history of the Mongols portrays it as such. There's been messengers probably going back and forth between the armies for years. Guyuk, he'd left the army just before the sack of Kiev in December 1240. And he and Munk both went back to Mongolia. He's not quite back in Mongolia as of yet. But you have to imagine this. His mother, Turgene, she's been the one in charge of the Mongolian government for the last few years of Ögedai's life. She's always wanted her oldest son, Guyuk, to succeed his father, Ögedai. And she's been planning for this for years. She's been putting stuff in motion, building her war chest, so to speak, and basically watching Ögedei drink and drink and drink himself to death. So on the morning of December 11th, 1241, she walks into Ögedei's camp, finds his stinking, bloated corpse lying on the floor. Now, he wasn't in Karakoram, though, was he, when he died? It was a bit south?
Yeah, it was south. It's not substantially, but it was south of Karakoram in a place called Ötegu Kulan, or Hulan, which is...
Old wild horse mountain.
Yeah, old wild ass, special kind of wild ass of Mongolia, the Kulan. It's still there, I think. And then there was a mountain, and so now this has become a national park, not because of Ögedei's death, but despite it. It became a popular... It's a nice scenic place, so that's probably where he was. But for our purposes, it wasn't any closer to Hungary than if he had died in Karakoram.
It was essentially a couple days travel away from Karakoram.
Right,
so,
and if he died in a more remote place where information could be controlled better.
Yeah,
and that's another factor we might
exactly. This is not in the big palace in Karakoram. It's in a hunting camp some ways south of the city. So Torgini, she knows Guyuk's coming home. She knows Guyuk and Batu had a falling out, and now Ögedei is dead. Presumably only the staff in the palace itself, or in the camp at Ötegu Kulan, know that he's dead. Now, if you're Torgini Hatun, and you know your son has had a falling out with Batu, is it in your interest to recall Batu immediately and have him show up right away with a huge army at his back, and presumably solve the issue with Guyuk's, with their falling out, or ensured Guyuk didn't make it to the throne?
We can take a modern example just because human nature is what it is. When Stalin died, the system was very unstable. You know, it's a empire, massive Eurasian empire. When Stalin died, Beria, and I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but Beria did not want Zhukov to know. He didn't want this to be broadcast on the media. There was tight control at first. There's a meeting of a very tiny group of people, and they're saying, what should we do here? Because this is a highly volatile, highly dangerous situation. And long story short, people in Karakoram who were supporters of Guyuk or his son or whatnot, like the queen, Toragene, she's not going to want this information to go out right away with no plan to a massive army by a potential rival, Batu, under a potential rival. So there can be a delay, and maybe even the information would get out involuntarily. I don't know, I wasn't there, but there's going to be some kind of control that's going to delay the message going out right away.
In short, what we're saying is that it's highly unlikely that the news of Ögedei's death broke out immediately on December 11th when his body was found. Might even have been a couple days later. Might even have been a month later. We don't know precisely. Sure, we don't have that information.
There would have been an attempt to silence any kind of rumors about this, and I mean, this happened when the first emperor of China died, Qin Shi Huangdi.
Yeah.
Same when Genghis Khan died. It's very similar. But it's not so different with Genghis Khan. There's a very mysterious thing where this is a very volatile time, because there's people who want the throne, there's people who want to be the successor, and they don't like each other, and they have big armies.
Well, we literally have all of these sources about Genghis Khan's death having him say, keep my death a secret. And so there's already precedent in the Mongol Empire for this being the case. So I would imagine at the very least Torgene is keeping the news of Ögedei's death from spreading at least until Guyuk is in Karakoram itself, or closer to the capital, or sort of till he's in place. In addition to the fact that it seems incredibly unlikely that even if they left on December 11th, 1241, that these messengers would have traveled all the way over Asia in the middle of winter. And this is before a proper YAM system has been set up. All right. There's kind of what we get from the travel accounts is kind of a pretty, like immediately after this period is a kind of a pretty sparse setup. This is just after the Mongol conquest. When Batu returns to the steppes in what's now Ukraine, the first thing they had to do was put down a Kipchak revolt. So this land has not even been fully consolidated yet. There is no quote-unquote highway from Karakorum to Western Hungary at this point. And even briefly on the remark of it taking 100 days to get from Karakorum to Sarai on the Volga, it's probably another, I would think at least another 2 months from the Volga River to Western Hungary, where Batu and the army actually was.
A lot of information about how fast, and it is impressive. The Mongol postal system is one of the great accomplishments of medieval history, and Marco Polo from Italy said as much. But he was talking about the system from Mongolia through China, where they'd already kind of inherited a postal system from the Liao dynasty earlier, and even from the Uyghur times, and they had this sort of system like this going through Asia. And so Marco Polo's information about how many, like 100 kilometers in a day or more, it's not really useful, because that's when you have a tightly controlled, densely populated network.
Now the YAM systems, they require a significant local population to support them, because there's just a ton of information on all these local populations complaining about being essentially extorted by the users of the YAM system and stuff. So it seems doubtful that any sort of proper communication network, or at least a fully organized one, was properly set up. And for point of comparison with Marco Polo there, that's also, when he's talking about that at the end of the 13th century, that's also in a region where the Mongols have ruled it for 60, 70, 80 years. They have total control. Like you said, there's this huge population base versus they've only finished conquering this part of the Western steppe, at most 5 years before. There's revolts. There's a lot of confusion. It's in the midst of establishing that new administration. And it's in the middle of winter, having to cross all the way across Asia. And like we've already said, this news is almost certainly unlikely to have left immediately upon the finding of Ögedai's body. Now,
a European traveler, just as a last point, went to Kazakhstan and endured the winter, and he watched as winds came and upturned the yurts, the gurs of the people, the tents, these big felt tents that people in Central Asia nomads have used. He saw them become unrooted and throw the people inside the tents around, and he said this is much more rough and rugged. The dead of winter in the steppe is not such a beautiful, poetic idea as you might think. It's grueling, and the conditions are life-threatening, and so you even have to wonder, imagine one messenger had been dispatched. Do they really think he's going to make it to Hungary? Are they absolutely sure he's not going to die on the journey? Sorry, we're covering every detail, but when you add it all up, this is what I said in my dissertation and in an article you can get it's part of a volume. It's called Mongol Inroads into Hungary.
Yeah, that's in the Routledge Handbook of the Mongols in East Central Europe or something. We'll put it on screen here, and you can get it from Routledge.
Alexander Mayarov and Roman Hautala have put together a volume with a lot of the scholars from East Central Europe. So it's the latest.
Yeah. This is not being sponsored, but click this link. I will not, wherever the link's going to be. I will not get paid for this, so just read this if you want to learn more. Yes, and we're assuming that any messengers who left even went across the steppe, because it's foreseeable that they cut through area the Mongols had greater control over. So through Central Asia, Transoxiana, went south around the Caspian, through northern Iran, came up through the Caucasus, and met Batu's army through that route. So you can see, so from Karakorum to Kiev, 142 days.
Yeah, this is a map designed by a Hungarian fellow and myself, both having interest in this topic, how long it would take to get from Mongolia to Hungary. And these are some of the travelers in the Middle Ages who made either some or all of this journey. Very telling one is Benedict the Pole and John of Plano Carpini, because they travel from Kiev to Karakorum. It's most of the distance, but not. It's still a long ways to Budapest from there to Hungary. And it was 142 days, and Carpini and Benedict the Pole both mentioned that they would switch horses, and they were traveling with the Mongol postal riders, and they were switching horses several times per day to keep the horses going as fast as they could trot.
They're essentially riding like Mongol messengers would, because they were traveling on the Yam route.
Yeah, and you can't really overwork the horse, or else you're in a much worse situation, if you keep losing horses on this route. So, and a lot of their journey, that long one there, was in the cold season. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And Marco Polo did say travel was harder in the Mongol Empire in the cold season. Slower, specifically.
Now, I would add, too, now, we're also not just making like what ifs and things based on calculations. There are primary sources that say the Mongols did not learn of Ögedai's death until after the withdrawal began. Rashid al-Din, the great Ilkhanid vizier and historian, arguably the single most important source on the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, he says as much, that they don't learn of Ögedai's death until they're already back in the steppe. Now, there is John de Plano Carpini, who is a Franciscan friar who travels through all of these lands. We just saw him on the map there. He travels through the Mongol Empire to arrive at Guyuk's enthronement in 1246. Now, he does say something to the effect of he thought the withdrawal was due to Ögedai's death. He was not part of the army. He's not access to internal Mongol military documents or anything. This was when he's learning of these things during his route. He puts two and two together and he makes that assumption.
Yeah, he was asking people, but we don't know if these people told him the truth. We don't know what they actually told him, because part of it's his own interpretation, and we don't know if it's a cover-up. So if they said, oh, the Khan died, so we had to go back, say a Mongol told him that, it might be not true. It doesn't have to be true. And a Russian, if Russians told him that this could be what they heard. It doesn't necessarily, or how they were explaining it, because he did have some Russian informants, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. The
timing is suspect. It's hard to not look at, wow, Ögedai dies, the army retreats, and go, wow, this lines up really well. But when you get into it, it's such a feat to have made the distance from Karakorum to Western Hungary in less than 4 months. I would argue in the dead of winter, it's effectively impossible. And this is all on horseback. These are not estimates on someone walking on foot. These are all the estimates of someone making this journey on horseback.
And Jack, you have some experience with horses, right? Unlike many of us Canadians and North Americans who, will talk about these things without really knowing much about the raising of horses and how to keep them from dying. What kind of insights would you add on this? Because,
well, the first thing to remember is the fact that the Mongols generally feed their horses off of fodder, through grazing. Generally do not supply grains and things for their horses. So they are not traveling between depots, say, or carrying a bunch of feed with them or a supply train for these messengers. The expectation would be normally your horses, you ride part of the day and the horse feeds off of the grass and stuff to sustain itself. This is a lot harder in winter. Obviously, if there's a proper yam route set up, then they just change horses at all of these stations. But as we've been saying, it's unlikely this yam route set up part of the day. So if there's not a proper yam route set up and a fellow has to ride a horse longer than necessary, now he has to take part of the day out to feed the horse. And I don't mean he has to take some grain, oats, barley out of his knapsack and put it into a feed bag on the horse, because he's not carrying that. Let's be generous and say this guy's traveling with 5 horses and changing a horse every single day. He should be doing it more than that if he's riding all day, but if you're feeding a horse just off of grass, like a steppe pony off of grass, I think the rule of thumb from what I've heard is like you give them like the whole like ride for the morning and then they eat grass the rest of the day. If you want this horse to live, if you're going to keep riding it on and on and on. A horse is not a car. It will burn a lot of energy just to stay warm. And that's why you normally feed extra in the winter anyways, and you'll feed instead of like 2 meals in the day, then you'll split it out into smaller meals. You keep that heat up. And with grains and things, these we say they burn hotter is what we call it here. Just because I don't really know how to say it. It gets the horse hotter, keeps it warmer. But grass doesn't get as hot, especially grass that's dormant, doesn't have a lot of nutrients, buried under snow. Now, of course, that's making the assumption that the guy is doing it, that he doesn't have postal stations and stuff. If he does have some sort of postal stations, it's still going to be a harder route. If this is deep snow, the horse has to work a lot harder. It's going slower. A horse is still going to suffer from the cold. The Mongols do not generally coat their horses because they just rely on the winter coats and everything. But if you end up in extreme conditions and the horse is fatigued, then it's going to struggle to basically say it can get exhausted, weak, not going to run as efficiently, like all of these things. It's just everything's harder in the snow. There's not much of an advantage to doing that.
And if you look at Rubric here, the Green Line, he's another European emissary who traveled with Mongols. And just to get to that point about the grass that you mentioned, and that these animals can die, and then you're really in trouble if you're in the middle of Central Asia in the dead of winter with no horse anymore. They all died. You're guaranteed you're probably going to die too. And this Green Line, this is Rubric's journey with Mongolians, and he said there was this one really risky part, because he goes, there's only a little grass along the bank of the creek, and you're moving along this creek, and there's just this thin line of grass. And if someone didn't have this knowledge of horses that you're mentioning, that line just might not mean anything. But really, it's about this thin line of keeping these animals that are keeping you alive from starving.
It's highly unlikely the messengers got there before the army withdrew. We have sources backing this up. There isn't a requirement for Mongol troops to have to return to the capital for the election, and there isn't desire in the capital to have this army returned right away. So that's why not just us, but many scholars are unconvinced by the political explanation. Now, there was infighting in the army, but it does not seem to have been a primary instigator in any of their movements that is causing them. They were not falling back because some princes wanted to. This would have been a decision by the army command as a whole.